Hi everybody, David here with Cascade Components. Today I'm going to be walking you through the install of the Cascade Components link on the Forbidden Druid. To install the link on your bike, you'll need the link itself, you'll need grease, 5 and 6 millimeter Allen wrenches. If you have an Allen wrench with a longer reach on it, that will be helpful. You'll need a torque wrench, a shock pump, and a piece of string or some other way to tie up the rear triangle. The first step in installing your link is removing the rear wheel. So we'll get that out of the way and set it aside. So now that the rear wheel is out of the way, we're going to go through and loosen up all the bolts we can get to. So we'll loosen up our shock bolts. This is where having a longer reach wrench is helpful, as the wrench can fit in to remove the rear shock bolt without having to scratch the frame. And we'll also loosen up these two pivot bolts here. They're 5 millimeter on one side, and you can use a 6 millimeter wrench on the other so it doesn't spin. Now that we have all the bolts loosened, we're going to come through and we're going to remove the rear shock. So we'll do this by removing the front bolt first. You can grab onto your swing arm, remove the bolt, let the shock drop, and let the swing arm slowly come down. Letting the swing arm come down will give this bolt a lot more room to easily be removed from the frame. Now that we have both bolts removed from the shock, we can get this out of the bike. And you can do that, just carefully wiggle it as it works its way out. And remove the shock. Now that your rear shock is removed, we're going to remove this piece of axle hardware and set it to the side. At this point, it's going to be easiest to grab your string or whatever you're going to use to tie up the swing arm out of the way. In this case, I'm using a couple old toe straps, some pedal cages. Now that we have our swing arm tied up and out of the way, you can see that we have ample room to get our bolt out. If you have the swing arm all the way down, this bolt is behind the chainring and you won't be able to remove it. To remove the axle bolt, using a 10 millimeter Allen wrench can be helpful. You can use this to push the axle out of the bike. So now that we have our axle out of the way, we'll set that aside. We'll remove the wrench from the frame. Now that we have the axle removed from the frame, you can get your hands under here and you can push down on this rate control linkage to get it out of the way. Now there's two bearing spacers here on the frame. These might come out, so have your hand ready to catch them. Otherwise, now's a great time to remove them so you can clean them. So now we need to remove the main pivot bolt. You'll use your 6 millimeter Allen wrench on the drive side of the frame, your 5 millimeter wrench here. This one you'll want to back with the 6 millimeter wrench for sure, because it is not uncommon to have the link rotate when you break this bolt free. So we'll remove the axle hardware, set that aside. Remove your 6 millimeter wrench. And again, we'll just use a 10 millimeter Allen wrench to help push the axle out of the frame. We now have the axle removed. And at this point, we'll pull out our stock linkage as well as the rate control link all in one piece. Just like before, there are two bearing spacers in the inside of the frame as well. So we'll remove these to clean and reinstall later. Okay, now that we have our stock link and rate control linkage off of the bike, we need to separate these two pieces. So it's a 6 millimeter Allen wrench. This part can be kind of tricky as this bolt is fairly tight. So the easiest way to do it, at least for me, is hold it in your hand and just give it a loosen. And once this bolt is pulled out, There'll be 2 more spacers in here. These can be removed all in one piece. So now with everything taken apart, we want to take a minute to go through, clean all the grease off of all the spacers, and get it ready to be reassembled. Now that we have all of our hardware cleaned, we're going to go through and add some grease to it. The bearing spacers here have the part number on one side. The side with the part number also has a little ridge on it right here. That is the side that faces the bearing. So we'll add some grease to there. Don't need a lot, just a couple little drops is all you need. We'll also apply a little bit of grease to the bolts on the smooth part of the hardware. Just a little drop, and spread it around with your finger. Don't need much, just a little bit will do. Okay, now that we have everything greased, we'll start the reassembly process. So we'll grab our link and the rate control linkage. The easiest way to remember this, at least for me, is to assemble this just as it sits in the bike. So you'll see on the rate control linkage, it tells you right here, ensure correct orientation with the drive side to this side. Set that like that. We know the linkage itself sits in the bike like this. So we can go ahead, install the 2 bearing spacers. The grease will help these stay in place. Now we have the bearing spacers there. We can slide the assembly into the rate control linkage and get everything pretty well lined up. And we can grab our 6mm Allen wrench and snug this down. Now at this point, it's easiest to torque this bolt. For demonstration purposes, I'm not going to, but you can reference the Forbidden Druid exploded parts diagram for the torque spec on this bolt. So now that that is done and assembled, we'll grab the rest of our bearing hardware here and we'll get that in place on the frame so we can put everything back together. All right, to start the reassembly process, we're going to reinstall all of our bearing spacer hardware. We've gone through and cleaned up the frame a little bit here off camera, but our little bit of grease will help hold all these in place. All 4 of these bearing spacers are the same part number. It doesn't matter where they go. Just stick them all in place here. Now that we have the bearing spacers back in place, we're going to take the shorter of the 2 bolts and our rate control linkage with the Cascade components link, and we're going to install this as one assembly. You might knock the bearing spacers off. Keep talking part. Oh geez, they're all falling off. Just try and be careful getting the linkage back in place. It's going to be a snug fit, but it will fit. Now we'll get everything lined up and install our axle. Again, this might take some working to get it all aligned, but it will eventually go. So now that we have the main pivot bolt in, we'll get the rate control pivot bolt in. And to do that, we'll just swing our rate control link up into place. Get everything aligned, and then grab the longer of the 2 axle bolts. And get that installed. Now that the 2 axle bolts are installed, we're going to assemble them completely. So this will just thread on, and the main pivot. If your bolts don't have any Loctite on them, now's a great time to add a drop or 2 of Loctite. Now that we have both pivot bolts fully assembled, we can use our 6mm wrench on the back side and our 5mm wrench on the front side. And again, we can torque to spec with Forbidden's torque spec. Again, for demonstration purposes, we're not going to be doing that today, but you do want to make sure that when you're torquing the bolts that you have the bolt backed with the 6mm wrench. Now that we have the swing arm lowered back down, we'll reinstall our shock. So we'll fish this through the frame and get the back eyelet lined up. Might make it tricky if you have a water bottle cage. You may want to remove it, but you may not have to. So you may need to wiggle the shock to get it lined up in the link. And once you have the back eyelet lined up, you grab your bolt and install it. Again, you might have to wiggle it. And we can snug this down. Okay, now that we have the back bolt snug, we'll get the front shock mount in place. And to get it in place, you'll have to lift up slightly on your swing arm. And you'll have to wiggle the shock around a little bit. And we'll get this snug down as well. All right, now that you have everything torqued and your wheel back on, the next step is to check for clearances between all moving parts. So to do that, we're going to let the air out of our air shock. If you have a coil shock, you want to take the spring off the shock and then put the spring retainer back on and get the shock reinstalled on the bike. So we'll let the air out. And this will allow us to check for clearances between all moving parts throughout the whole range of the suspension travel. So what we're going to do is pay careful attention inside the shock tunnel here, make sure nothing contacts. And we'll go to full bottom out, which we have plenty of room between the bolt, the link, the shock has plenty of room everywhere. We're good to go there. So in addition to checking in the shock tunnel, we just want to look through here and make sure nothing's contacting or binding. Should have plenty of clearance up here between the back of the seat tube and the swing arm, so we're good there. The last clearance you need to check when installing the link is to make sure your chain is the right length. So to do that, shift your chain into the biggest gear on your cassette, which in this case is a 52 tooth. You want to compress the suspension all the way to full bottom out and grab your derailleur cage and just make sure you have a little bit of slack there where the chain can move. In this case, we're good. If for some reason your chain is too short, it will prevent the suspension from traveling through the whole range of motion. Now that we've gone through and checked clearance between all moving parts, the last step in installing your Druid link is to set your sag. Most people will prefer 29 to 32% sag with our link, and most people will have to increase their spring rate or shock air pressure by about 10%. So to check your sag and get your sag set, we do have a video detailing that if you need that for reference. After you get your sag set, we recommend going for a ride and adjusting your spring rate and compression and rebound settings to suit your liking. So that's the total install of our link on the Forbidden Druid. The next step is just to go out, have fun, and ride your bike. For any more information on this link or any of the other links we make, check us out at cascadecomponents.bike. Otherwise, have fun riding.